So welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Lisa Ertl, the Director of Science at Five Gyres. Thrilled to welcome you all to our State of the Science panel. We have a very exciting group of panelists. I'm very happy to see you all. There's also a lot of our partners and supporters of Five Gyres here. Thank you so much for all you do, and thank you for joining us. To keep things moving smoothly, for everyone who is attending, we ask that you just please hold your questions to the end. We'll have some time for a Q&A. Today we're talking about bioplastics and what we're doing to improve the science and how we feel that when it comes to bioplastics, there's a lot of nuance to whether new materials are a solution or are adding to plastic pollution. Many of you have probably seen headlines and bold claims with black and white assertions using phrases like "don't trust these materials," "they're not everything they're promised," or industry that's pushing bioplastics and exaggerating claims. We're also seeing in the latest negotiations for a global plastics treaty, which we're wrapping up last week in Nairobi, biodegradable plastics remains a constant question for negotiators. How should bioplastics be approached and where it should be applied? There are certainly lots of concerns and lots of attention on biodegradables, but it often lacks the science. Science shows us that design, environment, temperature, chemical additives, all these things really matter. And we'll cover what we know about these materials, where it offers promise, and talk about where these materials fit and also where it doesn't. So we've brought experts to help share the state of the science, innovation, and discuss the balance that we need between rejection and also acceptance of biodegradable plastics. Our goal today is to discuss some of this nuance and hopefully dissect the hype, challenge some doubts, and lead us to an understanding of where there's a genuine need for effective bio-based materials. But first, I wanted to introduce our panelists. Each bring a unique perspective and expertise to our discussion. We have Jonathan Taylor. Jonathan is a Five Gyres board member and a chemical engineer with extensive experience in plastics research, development, and manufacturing. He has a decade of industry experience, and his work as a consultant helps businesses integrate sustainable plastics and novel materials into products. We have Julia Marsh. Julia is co-founder and CEO at Sway, innovating in next-gen packaging made from seaweed. Julia brings a unique perspective on bioplastics, novel materials, and alternative feedstocks, emphasizing the need for better solutions and end-of-life considerations. She also brought some fun props, which I'm hoping she'll pull out. We have Matt Prindiville. Matt is CEO of Clink and a recognized leader in the circular economy space. Matt served as the CEO of Upstream for nearly a decade to help businesses, nonprofits, and governments to accelerate and scale circular economy strategies. We have Dr. Ramani Narayan. Ramani is an internationally acclaimed expert in bioplastics from Michigan State University, is a distinguished professor in the Department of Chemical Engineering and Materials Science. Ramani is a fellow of the U.S. National Academy of Inventors and ASTM. He helped develop ASTM and ISO standards on plastics compostability and biodegradability in soil and marine environments. He's an advisor to the Biodegradable Products Institute and European certification organizations. His research covers the design and manufacture of bio-based and biodegradable compostable plastics and biofiber composites and conducting LCAs. And we have Marcus Erickson. Dr. Marcus Erickson is co-founder of Five Gyres with a rich background in researching marine plastic pollution. His contributions include co-publishing the first global estimate and the discovery of plastic microbeads in the Great Lakes, which led to the Federal Microbead-Free Waters Act in 2015. Marcus has testified before U.S. Congress on bio-based plastics and co-led with me the Five Gyres report Better Alternatives 3.0. which we'll get into today. And for those of you that haven't seen it, we will drop it into the chat. We'll also share some materials as we go along. Thank you all so much for being here. Jonathan, I would love to start with you. I think I've told you this before, but as an ecotoxicologist, I've always wanted to have a polymer chemist in my pocket, someone that can help disentangle the complexity of plastics. There's hundreds of polymers, thousands of additives. So to start us off, can you talk a little bit about the distinction and clarify bio-based and biodegradable plastics and whether plastic source determines biodegradability?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of people struggle with this one. And to put it simply, bio-based plastics are plastics whose main components or raw materials were derived from a biological source. So you can think of something like corn or wheat. They ferment that, and that becomes ethanol, and they use that ethanol to react and turn into a plastic. And that compares into biodegrading plastics. Biodegrading plastics are plastics that microorganisms, living organisms, can actually consume and use as a food source. And so that's the key difference between a biodegrading plastics and a bio-based plastics. And bio-based isn't always biodegradable. So plastics like green LDPE, I'm not sure if you've heard of that before, but those are bio-based. They typically derive those from sugarcane, but they're not biodegradable, meaning that living organisms can't degrade those rapidly enough, according to ASTM and TUV and the certifications that are out there. So maybe that kind of summarizes in a little bit those two.
I think that's great. And I think if you're interested in learning more, there's so much confusion and discussion online. Even just today, there's a comment on one of Sway's LinkedIn posts, and Ramani, thanks so much for responding to it and providing some more clarity. So for those of you that are interested in reading more on definitions, we just put that into the chat. Marcus, in our recent Five Gyres report, Better Alternatives 3.0, it was several years in the making. I was wondering if you could talk about how a beach toy set this current study in motion and why focus on degradation in the environment.
So I would say that the study began with this beach toy. Actually, Matt and we were collaborating on Better Alternatives 2.0. Now, a lot of products we put into two environments, in the ocean and on land, just two places for 2 years. Took them out 2 years later, and many of the conventional plastics were still there. But this one PHA cup, it was gone. In the ocean, it was gone. On land, it was still there. And it was made, the only thing we had made from PHA. And that led us to Better Alternatives 3.0, where we took mostly PHA, PHB, PBAT. These are the main different kind of biodegradable polymers, and a few controls. We had paper straw, bamboo fork, and some polyethylene film. And we put those in 6 environments. We had a forest in Maine, the Everglades in Florida, the desert in California, the ocean in California, ocean in Florida, ocean in Maine, 6 environments. And we had 6 sets of these different 22 products. We pulled them out over 6 time periods over 18 months. I mean, it was really comprehensive. We're trying to answer that one question from the UN that you said in the beginning: how should biodegradable plastics be approached and where should it be applied? We want to understand that end of life story. And that's what this study really did.
And to pick up on that end of life bit, we can get more into some of the factors that impacted degradation. For those of you that are interested, you could also take a look at the report. We go into what makes these materials break down or not in the environment. But Ramani, I would love for you to pick up here, since when we're testing in the environment, we're looking at fragmentation down to 200 microns in size, so a fifth of a millimeter. These are small particles. But could you talk about how laboratory work and some of these standards complement these types of field studies and really advance our understanding of the mechanism of how these materials break down?
Yeah, so first I would compliment Marcus. It's very difficult to do an in-field experiment and do it in a way which you can get data and analyze it. So that is wonderful. But that simply lets you know about disintegration, how fast it goes. And if it completely disappears, you don't know whether it disappeared because the waves took it away or it became so small that you couldn't see what's there, right? It could be a potential. And so the lab studies is still a very excellent way to find out what happens to these materials. So the first point everybody should take home is that the end point, what defines biodegradation? Biodegradation, in my opinion, is the most misused and abused term in my entire career, right? And this has therefore now solidified into a definitive endpoint we all can coalesce around, and that is that the polymer carbon, the carbon which embodies your product, 90% plus of the polymer carbon should be converted or transformed to CO2 only due to microbial metabolism. So it is the biology of the microbes that should define the conversion of carbon to CO2, and that 90% plus should be converted. So all the ASTM ISO standards coalesce around this 90% plus. You'll see that, and there's a big understanding of it. You can't measure this in an open environment. You can't put detectors and all to do it. You have to do this in the lab. And that lab study needs to correlate with the real world. So it is going in parallel. So there is a test methods to measure biodegradability of these polymer products in aquatic environment, in compost environment, in soil environment. And there are definitive test methods, protocols that needs to be followed. And you provide the data which says 90% plus of your polymer carbon has been converted to CO2 in a practical time frame, and that you should show that graph, and then only should that be acceptable. So that's one part of it.
And I'd love to kind of dig into those standards a little bit more, and how we develop those benchmarks and using cellulosics as those comparisons. But before we get there, I was hoping, we could go all the way upstream, think a little bit about the feedstocks that are getting into some of these new materials. And Julie, I would love to kind of point this to you, and your take on new feedstocks and the role of seaweed, since we're on the eve of the next UN climate conference in Dubai, COP28. And when it comes to these discussions on decarbonizing, we're moving away from a reliance on fossil fuels. This is a piece of the puzzle too, not only how these materials are behaving at their end of life, but the feedstocks. Could you talk about these new feedstocks as a step forward, and maybe areas where we should be a bit cautious and put it in the bigger picture?
Yeah, I think to kind of fill out the picture of this loop of biological circularity, obviously we care so much about contributing back into natural systems and supporting loops, not just of mechanical recycling, but of biological recycling. But to complete that loop, you have to source from generous feedstocks that don't carry the same consequences that some of the alternatives have to date. So we're looking at corn, potato, sugarcane, trees as the primary inputs used in most bioplastics today. And then you're also looking at bacterial fermentation of canola oil or rapeseed oil. A lot of these inputs can win in a lot of categories looking throughout a life cycle assessment. But if you want to go above and beyond in creating impact, we can also look at more novel natural polymers that are widely available globally, like seaweed. Unbiased, but I think that the future of materials should actually create value at every step of the supply chain. So when we're looking at potential feedstocks, they should be abundant, widely available, diverse, that we can embed biodiversity into sourcing strategies. And then they should use as little arable land, fresh water, time, chemicals, energy in their processing as possible. So that's what we're looking at SWAY. There is a whole wave of what we're calling regenerative or benevolent feedstocks being used in new materials, and I'm happy to speak to them in more detail for anyone who's curious.
Yeah, and we'll get to some of the uses of these materials, especially in your work in thin films. You know, when we're getting to the end of life, and to just to pick up on some of the things that you were talking about, Ramani, this word biodegradable is used and misused. Could you talk a little bit about the standards that are helping, you know, define what's happening to these items, especially, you know, packaging, which is a real need to find innovations for. Could you talk about the sort of end of life scenarios and how these terms like that get used or misused?
Sure. So the first thing the audience needs to recognize is that 90% of the plastics produced in the world, which is about 400 million metric tons, 90% of the packaging used is all what I call carbon-carbon backbone hydrocarbon plastics. This is the polyethylenes, polypropylenes, and they're great polymers, but they're fundamentally at the end of life, they will not biodegrade. They do not work as a food source for microbes. They are therefore persistent. They degrade to micro and nanoplastics in smaller sizes and accumulate. That's the problem you have there, whichever way you look at it. So if one were to look at the substitution of these materials, then it opens up that whole area. So the first set of standards was defined, specification, and everything was defined around industrial composting. And that makes sense if you recognize that 55% plus of the waste stream, municipal solid waste stream, is food and biodegradable organic waste. And today, we bury them in landfills and we don't really capture it. So, or you dump it just overboard. That releases methane, which, as all of us know, is as 25x global warming potential impact. So clearly we need to divert this away from this climate change, you know, methane, global warming, you know, greenhouse gas. And the alternative is composting. Therefore, any packaging or material that you use to preserve, protect the integrity of your food and other paper and other products must be compliant with the end of life that we are now designing these to go to, away from landfills. And therefore, these products must be designed to be compliant with the food and organic waste biodegradability. And those are the standards which today exist and very cleanly followed. You know, specifications are there, certifications are there, validation is there. The marine environment poses a very complex problem. The first statement as an end of life, the marine environment is not our garbage dump. It's not a disposal environment. So designing for biodegradability because I'm going to use the ocean environment as the garbage dump is not acceptable. And that's not the purpose of making something biodegradable. But products which we use in the ocean environment, could be fishing nets, could be this, lobster pots, and many more products, or which inadvertently leak into the ocean environment, should not persist and accumulate and then have impacts on the environment. So there should be biodegradability built into products used in marine or inadvertently or potentially end up in the marine environment. Right? But these products are not going to completely biodegrade completely at that point in time. Therefore, you need to compare it with, say, a cellulose in that same environment, in the same temperature. And that's where the standards try to bring lab scale data to provide data points that you can therefore use as markers as to whether such a product is acceptable or not acceptable if it leaks into the marine environment.
And they provide a useful benchmark, looking at how quickly something cellulosic breaks down. We found in our recent Better Alternatives report that these PHA forks and straws were breaking down in similar timeframes as the bamboo and the other cellulosic products. I'd love to dig in more to environmental leakage and best uses for bioplastics. But before we get there, I really wanted to pick up on some of those end-of-life considerations. And Matt, would love you to jump in here. The marine environment is not our garbage dump, but we do have a lot of things that are entering garbage dumps that could be going to composting. Could you talk about where we're at in the US and some infrastructure changes that we might need to effectively incorporate bioplastics into waste management systems? I'd love to get to zero waste, but are we there? Are we there yet in infrastructure?
Not even close. You know, and I'm realizing too, I in the introduction, I probably should have mentioned just a little bit about the company Clink, because I used to run a circular economy think tank called Upstream. So with Clink, I'm now downstream. So Clink, we're a circular economy solutions provider, and so we created an innovation in bottle bill state, so places that put deposits on bottles and cans. You know, we turned a fairly time-consuming and not pleasant experience of going to a redemption center or feeding a reverse vending machine with your bottles and cans into, we have a bag with the tag that's tied to your account. You put all your bottles and cans in the bag, you drop it off. We call them sustainability stations in the parking lot of a retailer or another common stop location. And then we process all those bottles and cans. We make sure you get your nickels back or your dimes back. And then we bill the Cokes and Pepsis and Anheuser-Busch's of the world. And then we track all those materials. We get all those materials back into the circular economy. And so, you know, I've been a circular economy nerd for the last 25 years. And, you know, the two concepts that I think are really important to think about, and these are the same concepts that our customers on the retailers and brand side and consumers are thinking about as well, is it's life cycle impacts, not just of a particular material or product, but of a system, right? So a reusable packaging system is different than a recycling system. That's different from a garbage system or a composting system. So looking at the life cycle impacts of not just the products and materials, but the system itself, and then that whole concept of highest and best use. And unfortunately, you know, we've been in a situation where the recycling industry and the landfill industry has not really evolved much in the last 30 or 40 years. When you look at where we were, you know, when recycling and curbside recycling and bottle bills started to come on the scene 30, 40, even 50 years ago in the case of bottle bills, and where we are today, like not much has changed. And so when I go to, you know, material recovery facilities, I just got to tour a bunch of them in Europe, and went to several here recently in the United States. And I look at, you know, where they were at the beginning of my career. I mean, there's some changes, there's some new technologies that are in place. We got some more robots that have basically factored humans out, but we haven't done enough to really redesign and rethink these systems. And now you're introducing bioplastics into a system that isn't currently optimized. And there's just a lot of work that has to be done to figure that out. And so, you know, to shortly answer your question, Lisa, I mean, I think that there's a lot of work that we have to do with the existing system that really follows those concepts of technical materials and biological materials. I'm glad you guys incorporated that in your report. But now we've got a situation where we have this new type of materials that I saw in the report. We're not sure, are they biological materials? Are they technical materials? Are they a third material in the middle? You know, there's a lot of work that has to be done on the system side to figure that out.
Yeah, Marcus, do you wanna talk about that sort of technical biological material cycle?
I kind of wanted to hear from Julia and perhaps Matt as well, having gone to MRFs. Like, what is that end of life for some of these new materials? Because when we did Better Alternatives 2.0, there wasn't a whole lot out there. Now we're seeing so many different novel, you know, polymers being used. what is the end of life? Do the landfills and compost facilities need to catch up? And I would ask Julia perhaps first, like where's your stuff going once it gets out of the consumer's hands, post-consumer life of your product?
We have a range. So we want to design around the realistic consumer experience. Some people do compost. I live in Berkeley, people compost here. I realize that's not the global experience. It's certainly not even the experience throughout California. But we have designed all our materials for home compostability. I love this end of life because it is the only end of life you can see happen before your eyes. And in a time when people distrust materials, it's very powerful to see a material disappear.
And we're talking thin film, right? Mostly thin films.
Yeah. I'm talking, yeah. So at Sway, we exclusively are focused on annoying plastics, as I call them, the thin films, the ones that are really difficult to replace for most brands, that are a thorn in the side of a lot of packaging systems. An example is we did this bag for a shoe company. This particular film is actually hot water soluble. So we go a step further than it being home compostable. It's actually, you can mix it with boiling water and it will resolubilize. And it's truly only made from seaweed and plants, certified 100% bio-based. We also create product windows. These ones just launched literally today. So you have now a fully bio-based and curbside recyclable solution that is also compostable, creating more optionality at end of life. And the global mandate at Sway, regardless of the product produced and inclusive of the resins that we've made, is that all products need to be home compostable based on the TUV Austria certification, as well as industrial compostable. And when tested in compost environments with the Compost Manufacturing Alliance, as well as in partnership with a range of field testing partners throughout the United States, the material disappears entirely in less than 48 days, which some say is the fastest they have ever seen a thin film decompose. Now, of course, it is going to make its way into the wrong place. So when it goes to a recycling system, based on what we understand, it's just going to be sorted out, as with all thin films, because they gum up recycling machines, and it will be baled and sent to landfill. In a landfill, we can only speculate what will happen, and that's testing that's happening right now. Depending on the region, it will vary, as we know. But the assumption is that if it does float out of landfill, as most thin films do, or nearly 50% of thin films do, that it should not cause undue harm. To Dr. Narayan's point, that this material would not cause harm to wildlife or to marine systems.
Mm-hmm. And Jonathan, you've brought this up before too, that that there needs to be these environmental benefits, not just meeting consumer demand, being single use and ending up in landfill. Is that a concern, that if you don't have the right systems in place, that could be the fate?
Yes, for the most part, yes. Industrial composting facilities, whenever they see plastic, they essentially just, as Julie was saying, they chuck it. They don't take the time to just, even so, you may purchase, say, something like a compostable fork or compostable spoon, and you throw it in compost. Those things, in the grand scheme of things, they look the same as a petroleum-based plastic. So when those go to a composting facility, they're oftentimes they're not even hand sorted. They actually have machines that do the sorting, and they sort by density and weight and size and shape. And what ends up happening is it just gets sorted out the same way an ordinary piece of plastic would be filtered. So while they will biodegrade or compost at home, it's much harder when you look at it from an industrial perspective. They're concerned about time and not contaminating their sources of compost. So all those things are contributing factors to whether or not they're going to take the time to actually sort and identify, plastic products that will actually biodegrade.
As we develop composting infrastructure to exceed the dismally low level of organics recovery they have, less than 10%, we should design with these new materials in mind, and how to separate it out, because that, if they can't go through these facilities, but they get mixed in with the other items, then then it's not serving the same benefit of it becoming, you know, feedstock and a resource. I'd love to, you know, spend a little bit of time thinking about, you know, where these materials really fit. We talked a bit about single-use food packaging, and you know, Matt, but before we get into, you know, those uses for these biomaterials, and as well as other sectors, I was wondering, because of your experience in the circular economy and in reusables, could you share a little bit about how reusables, you know, really beats single use across a lot of metrics? You know, I think it's important to think about these single-use materials with also a bigger picture of reuse in mind.
Yeah, 100%. You know, the case for reuse really stems around life cycle science, right? And so when you look at whether or not it makes more environmental sense to, you know, have you know, let's say you drink 100 soda bottles over the course of a year, and then instead of having 100 soda bottles, you're washing one soda bottle, you know, 100 times. You know, that the life cycle impacts of reducing the amount of material, even when you factor in transportation and washing and all these other things, by and large, across most of the variables, the reuse just beats single use virtually every time. Now, there are cases that you know are outside of that, and a lot of that has to do with the size of the transport loop, and the materials that are chosen, but by and large, when you compare reusable packaging to single-use packaging, you know, those systems themselves have a much lower life cycle footprint per container and per use. And so, you know, when I think about, as a circular economy nerd, when I think about what we want to see more of, it always goes back to what is the highest and best use for a particular material, for a particular type of product in a particular type of system. And so we want to see, or I want to see, as many products being sold in reusable packaging as possible. Now, that taps out, as you guys know. There's only so many things that you can put in reusable containers. You're probably not going to, you know, have your meat, you know, wrap be a reusable container. Let's be real. And so then we want to start thinking about, okay, where are the applications for where recycling makes the most sense? So, you know, there's plenty of good use cases for aluminum cans and things like that. Then we want to move into, okay, for reuse is at the, you know, reducing the packaging totally. Selling a bar of soap without a package on it is probably the highest and best. Then we go to reusable packaging, then we go to recyclable packaging, and then we start to come down to other uses, right? So we know that meat wrap is that's the classic example that always comes to my mind. Let's have a compostable solution for that, right? And so when we start thinking about the appropriate uses for bioplastics and more compostable and biodegradable plastics, to me, we're looking at those types of uses, the things that don't lend themselves readily to reusable packaging, that don't lend themselves to where a technical material and a recycling system would be better. That now we're starting to look at those types of materials for those types of uses. And I think some of the things that Julia's, you know, her company's building, I mean, that makes perfect sense to me.
Mm-hmm. Thin films for meats and cheeses, replacing certain e-commerce packaging.
Candy bar wrappers. I mean, you know, when Marcus and I were looking at, when we were working on the original ban list report, however long ago that was, Marcus, it feels like ancient history now. You know, there were a lot of products that we were looking at that were highly littered products, for which you're not going to see those made, you know, they're not going to get into a recycling system, and they're not going to get into a reuse system.
Julia, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to share a small note. First, I didn't even acknowledge how cool it is to be on this panel in the first place, and the fact that Five Gyres inspired Sway to exist, and that the ban reports are the reason that we are focused on thin film. That's that they're the biggest issues. You're never going to have, like you say, Matt, a reusable meat cling film. You're never going to have a reusable Snickers bar wrapper. It's just not going to happen. And these are the films that are likeliest to end up into natural spaces. They are also most prevalent in regions that don't have access to the best infrastructure. So you want to design around that reality. And I also love the case where biologically degradable materials can actually increase the success rates of reusable or recycling systems, where you create cleaner streams by keeping contamination contained within compostable materials that then contribute to that loop of biological circularity.
We think a lot about these single-use products and packaging. Romani, you've spoken about how these are really important case studies for research because of the magnitude of waste, how much is produced, but also because it's so widely used and integrated into our waste management systems. These thin films for food packaging. But then what's next? What other sectors in society may have these appropriate uses of biomaterials as well? Maybe a question to Romani. You mentioned fishing gear, and then I'd love to open it up to the rest of the group.
Yeah, so the marine environment is a little complex issue, and it's almost tempting for everybody to talk about, I've got a marine biodegradable plastic. I don't know what that means, but it's biodegradable. And temperature, and in one of the questions which was asked, and I probably got into trouble on that, when a claim is made, we talked about claims by you saying hyped up claims and exactly opposite claims. So somebody asked the question, my product biodegrades in the ocean environment when I throw it away. No problems, couple of months, it's a statement, and every person would like to make that. And my example, which I'd like to reiterate here, is you can take a loaf of bread and leave it on the countertop and put it in the fridge. Well, the loaf of bread on the countertop is going to spoil and get moldy much before the one in the fridge. So how can you expect a film or a product in an ocean environment which is at 10 degrees, at 30 degrees, at 4 degrees, all break down and dramatically biodegrade away? It's not going to happen. And so there's got to be a realization that temperature dictates the rate of which this is going to biodegrade. And we need to be comfortable with that. We need to make sure that it doesn't persist and accumulate, whatever the time frame is. And therefore, an ASTM standard that is evolving is to compare the rate constant, if I get more technical on it, of cellulose as our control with, say, a PHBV or any of the products which Sway is going to put out. And I realize theirs will biodegrade even faster, and say that it's not going to biodegrade as soon as you throw it out, because then it won't fulfill the function for what it was used for. But compared to cellulose, it may last 3 years, maybe 5 years, but it is not persistent and accumulate over hundreds of years and then cause impacts. So we need to coalesce around this persistence and accumulation versus the rate, and identify materials which are closer to the cellulose rate constants. I'm sure Jonathan understands my words better than anyone else as a chemical engineer. Then simply saying, yes, it biodegrades, no, it does not. I mean, that's too simplified an answer. And maybe that's what everybody's looking for, but I don't think we can answer that. That's for the marine environment. But for the compostables space, clearly, the reuse is always going to have an LCA, as has been pointed out by Mark. But when we're talking about perishable products, when we're talking about products that are being transported across, when we are aware of pandemics and other issues, the gloves which we have to put in, they have to be made compostable, compliant with where its product that it is packaging is going to its end of life, which is industrial composting. So there will be roles for compostable plastics. Some will be taking a little longer, some shorter, but this is where I feel that the space for new materials, and soy is one of the examples of how you take a totally bio-based, non-food seaweed product and create plastics out of it for protection of food and other products, which, if it even leaks into the ocean, will biodegrade, but not put in mind the thought that if I throw it away, it's going to go away, no problems. It will impact, but the level will be much lower. It's going to take a certain time period to biodegrade.
It's not the desired end of life. Jonathan.
I'll be quick on this one. So the one thing I also wanted to tag in with about the rate of degradation and the dimensions. So Naran, you mentioned the temperature as well as the form factor and the dimensions of the product. So I think in 3.0, your report, you actually see that thin films, which are basically have a low depth, and so their dimensions are very thin compared to something like a fork or something like a cup. Remember, the microorganisms are responsible for breaking down the plastic. So the more space they have the more room they have, and the more available space they have, they're more capable of breaking down the material. So I think that's something that's really important to consider when it comes to design, is the actual dimensions and the form that your final product is going to take. And you asked about a good application. In my work with PHA, something that we did a lot of was agricultural films, which in the farm industry, how do I say this? They cover their crops with usually it's a black film, but it's just for retain moisture and other things. PHAs are great for that application because you don't have to go out and recover them. And oftentimes those bags that they use in the industry, they're not recovered. They end up getting lost in some various ways. So I found that those are some of the best applications for biodegrading plastics in general, is single-use, short-term lives, and applications where either they typically aren't going to be recovered, or they're much easier to recover. So I'll leave it at that.
We're going to do one-to-one replacements of all conventional fossil fuel plastics with bioplastics. Probably not. That's a rhetorical question. I'd love to move to some questions from the audience. There's a question from Matt. What are your plastic collection bags made of? Are they bioplastic?
They're not. No, they're polyethylene, and we do collect them and recycle them, so they all come to our plant. So it's easy for us because we can collect it all in aggregate, and we can sell it once we bale it. So, but yeah, I mean, it's a great question because I have a lot of personal interest in the polymers, like the feedstocks for polymers, right? So whether or not we're going to make polyethylene bottles from plants instead of fossil fuels, right, is something that, at the end of the day, as Jonathan and Ramani will say, that chemical signature of that polyethylene bottle is the same, whether or not it's made from plants or whether it's made from fossil fuels, right? So I think that we need to be sourcing more and more plastics from plants and instead of fossil fuels. But what we're talking about today is biodegradability, compostability, what happens if the stuff gets in the environment, et cetera, et cetera. I would, from my standpoint as a recycler, I'm looking for value. Marcus and I were having a little chat in the sidebar here, and for recyclers, what we're mostly looking for at the end of life is, does this material have value? Can we collect it at scale, and can we go find markets for it, and can we make money from selling it? Marcus asked me if we would collect bioplastics or films or things like that. If there's sufficient volume and sufficient value, we will. So I just want to throw that in there, that's the way that we think about these things as we're evaluating whether or not we want to get in the business of collecting something.
There's go ahead, Marcus.
Yeah, I was just going to ask. So Matt and Julia, do you think as the industry matures, is it just an issue of scale? Because you have lots of industrial composting facilities, like in Oregon, many of them said no more PLA. Is it that the volumes aren't there, like you said, Matt, to make them sort of make the investments to shift their sorting infrastructure to separate out some of the biodegradable plastics into an industrial composting facility? Is it a matter of scale?
Go ahead, Julie.
I think it's an issue of scale. I think it's an issue of education, both on the consumer side and on the waste management side. There are so many emerging materials that it's, yeah, we are forced to embrace nuance, and it's an incredible amount of information for anyone to take on. So I think the inevitability is that composting will become more accessible to more people. Inevitably, there's so much happening here in the States and globally to make that more a part of the norm. And there are global commitments coming from some of the largest brands in the world to help make that happen as well. So I think it's about the scale, but it's also about better messaging around new materials, perhaps greater control over how materials are branded. Like in Washington, all compostable materials need to be a certain shade of green or a certain shade of brown. And it's very easy for industrial composters, many of whom are doing manual sorting, to just recognize what is compostable and what's not. In the case of films, a lot of these materials that actually are compostable decompose so quickly that you wouldn't, in some cases, even be able to sort them out. So that's the reality that we're confronted with, is that if Sway were to replace a common snack bar wrapper, the intention would be that it would decompose in less than 48 days. So by the time that it's going through maybe a secondary or tertiary cycling, there's nothing for you to sort out in the first place.
Marcus.
It also seems to me that there is this holy grail where, a manufacturer wants to have a kind of packaging that meets their needs for product protection, whatever. But then it has to magically decompose in the environment. So we're seeing things like lots of additives and blends. And I'm wondering, Julie, if you're getting requests, people try to say, can you throw in some polyethylene into your film for this application? But do we want to get ahead of that and sort of restrict or guide industry not to blend materials or the other toxic additives that we know are toxic in the environment into biodegradable materials? How do we deal with the blends and the additives?
Marcus, just
Yes,
clarify. You should be satisfied that the standards, like the specification standard for compostables, specifically test that out. You are supposed, when you get that seal of certification, you have to verify and validate that there are no intentionally added chemicals, toxic chemicals identified in REACH. Their inks are supposed to be non-toxic, printable. All of that is covered in the specification standards. And so there is already an effort to sort of preempt and move forward with that. For example, PFAS, as you know, is a big issue these days. And if you look at the specification standard for composting, including the BPI certification, it says well before all this argument started that in order to get certification from the BPI, you should not have any intentionally added PFAS in your product. So I think the standards are moving in that direction. The last part on the composting, and this goes to Julia's and Sway's, are that composting is not an infrastructure to manage plastics. This seems to be the theme everybody's thinking. But composting is necessary for managing climate crises, because the food waste and other organic waste going into landfills is generating methane, which is, landfills are considered the second largest emitter of methane. First one, of course, are cows, but they're the second largest emitter of methane, a potential greenhouse gas. So we have to move what we are doing today to composting, and composting will evolve. This is not going to be the old composting where a windrow where you dump things in, you turn it around and do it. People are going to come up with newer designs, newer gadgetries, newer abilities to reduce the time. And so this whole area will evolve and change as we go forward.
We'll continue to see some variability though, so we'll have to test these different scenarios. Julia.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one more note to add on to Dr. Nayan's point, which was so good. But it's in addition to the new materials needing to certify and be adherent to this non-toxicity, my controversial opinion is that existing materials should also be forthcoming about the presence of PFAS. Like, how many people know that their butter packaging probably has PFAS in it? And why isn't that being displayed to the consumer? Why is plastic not held to the same standard that new materials are?
Because it's cheaper.
It's cheap, and there's a complex a mixture of additives. It can be really hard to, even understand what's in it in ingredients, but I agree that it needs to be held to that high standard. I think it's really interesting having this additive conversation because it's needed for conventional plastics too. And there's a question in here about how about cost, and Julia, maybe this is a question for you about the time horizon for bioplastics and packaging, for their cost to be the same or less than existing petroleum-based plastics. Is it realistic that it's gonna get to that same cost? Could you speak to that? What's our time horizon for costs to go down?
Well, let's figure it out in a year. No, our target for full transparency is to hit what Sway would classify as a commercial volume by 2025. And for us, that definition is about 5,000 metric tons of production. There are 118 million metric tons of LDPE produced every year. So for us to be expected to compete with that price point and all the efficiencies gained over 100 years is completely unrealistic and unfair. But what we can do is design our materials, as we have, to fit into existing infrastructure and around emerging legislation that brands are going to be incentivized to work with us. And that as we do grow to more and more thousands and then ultimately millions of metric tons of production, we can become competitive with a wide range of plastics, not all, but the ones that are relevant and should be compostable, as we've been discussing.
Go ahead, Ronnie.
Yeah, I want to challenge this. We are always asked, when is it going to be cost competitive? Why should it be cost competitive? I mean, you are providing value for the environment, and the cost for the environment is huge. Microplastics is a problem we cannot put back in a box. So why are we challenging the Sways of the world to make it cost competitive? They should sell it at double the price, because that's the price it costs for the environment. So it is good to have some regulatory teeth to say, as was pointed out earlier, that you cannot use PFAS, then you have to come up with a better product, right? So maybe I'm an academic purist, so I can afford to make these statements that you can sell it at higher price and get away with it. But that's the reality. And I wish more and more of us would take a stand and say, no, it's not going to be cheaper. It cannot be. You got to pay for the price to keep the environment clean. I think Five Gyres and all should take the lead on things like that. You have a good voice, and you should promote that.
It can't be as cheap, and would love to see in your LCAs all of the costs of the additives, of microplastics, and the impact on the environment, because it's no small thing. Matt.
Yeah, just building off that point, Ramani. I mean, so just to just to bottom line some of the things that we're working on, because we have a lot of interest from the producers of aluminum and PET plastic and the brands that use those materials to collect it where it's going to waste, which is you go down to the southern part of this country and 90, 95, 98% of that material is just going in the garbage. But they don't want to pay a penny more than they're getting, that material from Waste Management in the Northeast or California or somewhere else, right? Like, I mean, that really, when it comes down to what the material companies and the brands are willing to pay, they'll pay a little bit more. But the unit economics of making this work, that's why we think regulation is just so important. So bottle bills are great for getting, preventing litter from beverage containers and getting PET and aluminum and glass back into the system. Extended producer responsibility is fundamentally important for financing the infrastructure that's going to pull the rest of those materials into some kind of collection system where we can sort it, process it, and get that material back in the circular economy. If you just leave this up to market forces alone, there are some good things that are happening in the market, and I'll stop right here because I know we're out of time. But the mandates that are being pushed into the value chain from retailers, saying we want so much recycled content, things like that is actually having an impact, and we need to see more of that. So not just the actions that government is taking, but we need to see people in the value chain that have power, like retailers, putting pressure on the brands to do better.
That's right. Julia, would you like to comment? And then I'm gonna have one last question for you all.
Yeah, tiny note, just I'm reading the questions in the chat, and I do want to highlight that there are a lot of retailers, to Matt's point, who are adopting our solutions and are willing to pay more. And a lot of brands, across an array of sizes and industries, place value on new materials and the holistic social and environmental impact that new materials like ours can create. So there is a willingness to pay, and I believe that incrementally, as materials like ours become more accessible and easy to adopt, they will become a part of the norm and the costs will go down. So I, despite all this conversation, do feel hopeful for a future where materials that are better for the planet do make their way into the mainstream.
Well, that was my last question. Are you hopeful? And also, what developments and initiatives are you most excited about, and what should the audience be paying attention to? Julia, I'll let you continue your thought, and I'll go around the room.
I feel like I've talked too much on this. I'm very thankful to Five Gyres for promoting nuance in new materials, and I'm excited for the next ban reports and emerging field research that helps us to paint a more holistic picture of what happens to materials when they make their way into various environments.
There's a question whether or not we're having sway materials in the next better alternative, so we'll have to chat, and everyone should stay tuned.
Yeah, I'm thankful to the Tom Ford Plastic Innovation Prize and the accelerator that we're a part of. It's powered by Lonely Whale. Five Gyres was included in organizing this prize, and it's helping us gain access to commercial scale customers and manufacturing partners. And I'm really proud of our new product launch that just came out today via EcoEnclose. It's the first of many innovative materials that are now available to the public with the click of a button at an accessible price point.
Thanks, Julia. Lots to look out for. Jonathan, are you hopeful, and what should people be paying attention to?
Yes, I'm hopeful. I think the biggest thing for me, especially on the work I'm doing now, is with waste. So what are we going to do with really all of the quote unquote biodegradable waste and bio-based plastics? So maybe I'll leave it there, but that's what I think the biggest opportunity is in my world anyways, is how are we gonna solve that? How are we gonna either find an alternative use or an alternative pathway or better systems of collection? And then of course we can go further upstream with design, but that's where my focus is, and that's what I'm looking forward to.
Ramani? Just going in order.
I think I want to connect back with Matt, because I think we are the all these beautiful products, innovative products depend on composting, industrial composting. And that has to evolve from a simple, put it in your backyard kind of thing to a very efficient, which can handle waste in 4 to 5 days and put a product out. And there are mechanisms to do that. We are doing research on that, but change the face of composting, and that will evolve. And when that evolves, these products will be required because they won't accept. Like, for example, we have a dorm. It's called a residential RICE, which is the Research Institute for Study of the Environment. And all the food processing which happens behind the counter is collected in these bags. And they are put in what I call these bioreactors. And in 5 days, they're pushed out. It's a continuous, semi-continuous process. So now the product, which is more an amended product, is 70% reduced in volume, is then shipped to the student farms, where it is feed with vermicompost, and then you put it out to grow more things. So the whole biological cycle. If you put these kinds of reactors around places where there is a lot of this kind of waste, industrial campuses, then it will totally change how we're going to do things. And I think this fits very nicely with what Matt does, and hopefully something will come out of that.
Redesign, Matt, and we're over time, but a couple last final words.
Last thought, I mean, the thing that I'm most excited about is that the brands have really changed their tune on policy, and they're actually in many cases supporting extended producer responsibility. Beverage brands are coming out, changing their positions on bottle bills and deposit return systems. It's really changing the economic landscape for companies like ours, because it's just opening up lots of new opportunities. And so super excited about that. I also, I always want to be the voice of the consumer in this. At the end of the day, it's got to work for the consumer, right? So whatever systems we create have got to be simple enough that they can engage with, and not be overly complicated, not be overly burdensome, not be overly expensive. Yeah, I'm excited about the future.
And Marcus, I'll speak for both of us in saying that 5 Gyres is hopeful, and we're hopeful that we'll find solutions, especially with so many great folks who are working on this. I wanted to thank you all for all of your insights today. Also the audience for asking questions. Look for us on Instagram and X. We're gonna try to answer some of these questions that we didn't get to today. And again, thank you all for joining. Your support helps do this type of work and bring people together. Thanks to all of you who've already donated to Giving Tuesday. Just a reminder that it's not too late to contribute. We'll drop a donation link on our website if you feel inspired to give. And thank you so much for helping inspire solutions. Thanks all for joining.